This episode of New Politics was released on the 22nd of May, 2026, and produced on the lands of the Wangal and Gadigal people.
When does the Royal Commission stop being about protecting people from discrimination and starts to criminalise political dissent? And who decides what we can say about Israel and Palestine? Because if governments start to outlaw particular types of political criticism, well, democracy itself starts to fall apart. I'm Eddie Djokovic.
I'm David Lewis. All of this is coming up in this big episode of New Politics.
And if you're listening in and haven't subscribed to our website at New Politics, you're missing out on half of what we do. There's regular articles and analysis of this strange world of politics. It's all free, and you can subscribe at newpolitics.com.au. And of course, if you do want to support us, it's just $5 per month at Patreon and Substack, and all of this is a good way to support independent journalism. The Royal Commission into Antisemitism and Social Cohesion is starting to look like something completely different. And what started off as an inquiry into the Bondi attacks in December last year and then became an inquiry into the causes of anti-Semitism, and that was after much public pressure was placed on the Albanese government, and then went on to include social cohesion, just seems like this has morphed into something that will place limits on free speech and political debate in Australia and what's acceptable and what's not. And we've got a case where the criticism of the State of Israel, opposition to the ideology of Zionism, and even support for the Palestinian cause, well, that's being gradually reframed as anti-Semitism. And over the past few weeks at the Royal Commission, we've heard about how the sight of the flag of Palestine, university protests, anti-war slogans, cake stalls for Palestinian children, all of these have been presented at the Royal Commission as evidence of anti-Semitism, rather than the democratic right for people to oppose a genocide and apartheid that has been implemented by the State of Israel. And at the heart of this is the controversial IHRA definition of anti-Semitism, which now has been adopted by this Royal Commission. And this recommends that criticism of Israel and criticism of the ideology of Zionism is considered to be anti-Semitic. And generally, I just think that this push has to be resisted as much as possible, because if opposing an illegal occupation or state violence is all of a sudden deemed to be anti-Semitic, just because the State of Israel is involved, well, David, we may as well give up on democracy, because there just won't be any more point to it.
It's not to deny the existence of anti-Semitism in this country. Now, we've never had a lot of anti-Semitism, but I suppose if I was a Jewish person being called all kinds of names, I might disagree with that. But compared to some of our other dislikes in this country, shall I say, anti-Semitism is less in terms of frequency. Again, not non-existent and not unimportant, but we don't live in a country with a high Jewish population where aggrieved people from other groups see a large number of people and then try to make them the other. We live in a country where there are concentrated populations of Jewish people and then scatterings around. Again, I'm not saying that anti-Semitism doesn't exist. It does, but it's not the only anti or phobia around. It's not the least important, but it's not the most important. They're all as equally as important as each other, and all of them have to be stamped out. Now, when we get into criticism of a government, why shouldn't we be allowed? We criticise the Australian government all the time, the New South Wales government, South Australian, Western Australian, Victorian, Queensland, Tasmanian, Northern Territory.
And we broaden that to overseas experiences as well. United States government, British government, German government, every government around the world we can criticise.
Not because we are anti any of those people, but because we see areas in those governments that need criticism. Now, every single genocide scholar in the world, including Jewish ones, have called the situation in Gaza a genocide. If you can't criticise that, what can you criticise? Now, I absolutely agree. Benjamin Netanyahu shouldn't be called out because he's Jewish. That's just how he was born. That's presumably his faith. We can perhaps take him on the application of his faith, but he's not a bad person because he's Jewish. He doesn't do what he does because there is some inherent Jewish nature in him. He does what he does because he's a bad person. And to reduce people away from general bad humanity into Group X is bad because there are people in it who are bad, I think makes a mistake. At the Harbour Bridge protest, there were many Jewish people protesting and proud to be protesting and proud to be calling themselves Jewish and protesting. The other thing too we've got to be careful is not dividing people into good Jews and bad Jews, like Pauline Hanson divided Muslims into bad Muslims and no one else. There are good people, there are okay people, and there are bad people. And that's as there are good governments. And in fact, it's not even that. There are governments that do good things sometimes, and the same government can do bad things sometimes.
Oh, but just listening to what you were saying, David, but I think the other thing that we have to consider is what does free speech actually mean, or free political speech actually mean in Australia when it comes to Israel and Palestine, and specifically about those two countries, because it just seems like there's different standards that are applied to different countries and different conflicts. Now, when it comes to that idea of collective blame, and that's one factor that's been brought up by the Royal Commission, that the rise in anti-Semitism has been occurring because the Jewish community has been blamed for the actions of the government of Israel. And that, sure, that's a good point, but the only group that has condemned the actions of Israel over the past 2 years has been the Progressive Jewish Council of Australia, and they've actually been attacked by the other representative Israeli groups or Jewish groups within Australia. Generally, all of the other groups have been supportive of the State of Israel, even going to the extent of fundraising for the IDF. But setting that aside, still that idea of collective blame, I think, is a dangerous one. But it's just that we didn't seem to have concerns or similar sort of concerns about the Russian community in Australia when Vladimir Putin invaded Ukraine at the beginning of 2022. And the Russian-Ukraine war has got a lot of similarities in its complexities and geopolitical interference, but a lot of Russian Australians at that time, they experienced a lot of hostility and collective blame for the actions of Vladimir Putin. I'm not saying that's a good thing, just pointing that out, but there was just little concern about that from our political leaders, and it even seemed to be encouraged at that time. Here's an exchange between an Australian citizen of Russian descent, Sasha Gillies-Lakakis, and the host of the ABC's Q&A program at the time, Stan Grant.
So as someone who comes from the Russian community here in Australia, I've been pretty outraged by the narrative created by our media depicting the Ukraine as the good guy and Russia as the bad guy. Believe it or not, there are a lot of Russians here and around the world that support what Putin is doing in the Ukraine, myself included. Since 2014, the Ukrainian government, together with Nazi groups like the Azov Battalion, have besieged the Russian populations in the Donbass, killing an estimated 13,000 people, according to the United Nations.
That's a lie. That's a lie.
Could I finish?
Just quickly finish, and then we'll come to that and put that to the panel.
So my question is, where was your outpouring of grief and concern for those thousands of mostly Russians?
Since we had Sasha's question earlier about Russia, and it's been playing on my mind, and Sasha, people here have been talking about family who are suffering and people are dying, and I understand you wanted to ask your question about is there some reasoning for this, but you supported what's happening, hearing that people are dying, and can I just say I'm just not comfortable with you being here. Could you please leave? I've been... It's really... No, Sasha, I'm sorry. You can ask a question, but we cannot advocate violence. I should have asked you to leave then. It's been playing on my mind, and I'm sorry, but I have to ask you to leave, please.
So, David, I just cannot imagine that treatment being given to an Australian Zionist or a supporter of Israel. They'd probably... Q&A has been dumped by the ABC. It no longer exists. But even still, I reckon that person would still be sitting in that chair speaking 3 years later. They'd be egged on. They'd be saying, is there anything more you can add to your perspectives? But it's just that when it comes to Israel, it's always claimed that Israel has got a right to defend itself from what we don't know, or it's just a unique situation, or that its circumstances are just so different to every other country in the world. But I just think that in these sort of situations, I think consistency would be an important thing to have.
Yeah, Q&A was a show I'd never watched very much. It was full of a smug audience, non-experts talking over the top of experts, a discussion that went nowhere in the end. On the few occasions it had a good panel, it could have been a really great show, but it had a succession of hosts who thought the show was about them rather than about the idea at hand, and so weren't moderating a discussion so much as performing role that I didn't think was vital.
And also booting out audience members that they disagreed with.
Yeah, it seems to me that if the idea can be debated, then let it happen. Two things strike to mind: having the idiotic Malcolm Roberts on with the top climate scientist in the world, and having Roberts throw meaningless data to try and show I'm right and you're wrong. It was embarrassing. The other thing that I remember is David Irving coming to Australia. Now, I'm no fan of Irving. I think he changed from interesting to provocateur without any thought. His evidence became highly selective. And of course, he started being feted by right-wing groups in which he did not distance himself from. But he came when I was at university some decades ago. There was a big protest saying he shouldn't be allowed in. And I was asked to join the protest, and I said, no, let him in and destroy him. If he's wrong, which he is, 20 minutes of refutation. And then the not unreasonable argument was that the press here were really supporting him and that counter-arguments wouldn't get through anyway. Yeah, sure, that's not a bad point. And also that it was very upsetting to people who had lived through the Holocaust and had family who died and what have you. And I thought, yeah, that's not unreasonable either. But his case to his allies was strengthened because they could say, oh, look, they're so scared of what he says, they suppress him. So, yeah, Grant should have let the guy speak, and either he's got a good point or he doesn't. And if he doesn't have a good point, the television audience was fairly brutal. If he did have a good point, then everybody goes away with something to think about.
But I think it is that way that different groups are treated, certainly within Australia, and that's the point that I was making, that idea of collective blame, that should not be apportioned to anyone. So it's just an observation that there's different treatment for different groups. One is acceptable, the other one is not.
Yeah, and we're not at war with Russia, we're not at war with Israel. So why you would suppress dissident views is questionable. And yet Stan Grant is positing himself as a public intellectual. I don't think it's how I would have handled it. I'll also be fair to him, we don't know what's going on in his earphone with producers saying, throw him out, this will be great television, or throw him out, this is making us uncomfortable. And that might have happened too.
This is New Politics, independent analysis of Australian and international politics. For more free articles and analysis, join us at newpolitics.com.au.
And this Royal Commission, well, it keeps talking about this idea of unity and social cohesion, but if this inquiry is genuinely about social cohesion, why have Palestinian voices been excluded, or other people? And the critics have said, oh no, this Royal Commission is all about anti-Semitism. Well, okay, well that is the case, but the other part of it is about social cohesion. Let's get some other people in. Let's get some Palestinian people to talk about their perspectives on anti-Semitism and their idea of social cohesion. And we had the representatives from the Australia-Palestine Advocacy Network, and they requested leave to appear at the Royal Commission, but that was denied. And I think broadening the amount of people that, or the scope of people that could attend, I just think they would have provided for a better Royal Commission, both in terms of the final findings, but also politically. It would have been good to have something that's complete and well balanced, rather than accusations of it being one-sided and a politically managed event, which is the accusation that we're making today. But if you're not going to be heard at the Royal Commission, well, you've got to take it to the streets. And this week marked 78 years since the Nakba, and that's the Palestinian Holocaust that Israel doesn't like to talk about, and that's where 700,000 Palestinians were ethnically cleansed and removed from their homes in 1948. And that's a general and generational trauma that is still being felt today. And that was recognised at the Sydney Town Hall last Friday night. So Australian institutions, they're trying to forget about the Nakba, to forget about Israel's war crimes and genocide. And to me, that's what the Royal Commission just seems to be trying to do. And the state eventually, well, they're trying to criminalise the remembrance of all of these particular sorts of issues. But the social cohesion that the Royal Commission keeps talking about, I just don't think that's going to arrive if you're only listening to one part of the community and if you're only remembering one set of traumas and not the other.
Exactly. Should we remember the Holocaust? Definitely. It was a horrible thing that should never have happened and is a stain upon all humanity. So is the Nakba too. And maybe the Nakba's at a slightly lower level in terms of numbers, but it was still something that should never have happened. Bondi should be remembered. But then again, so should Gaza and the flattening of Gaza City. We could go on and on. The Armenian genocide should be remembered. The Rwandan Hutu versus Tutsi genocides, the Indigenous Australian genocide should be taught properly in schools, not given this weak both sides argument, but taught properly that there was a frontier war in which a lot of stuff happened. And to forget this stuff strips us of our humanity. And yes, it's the bad humanity, but part of being human is that we can do wonderful and amazing things, and part of it is that we can be absolutely awful. And if we don't understand that, it's the awful side that goes out of control. And without that understanding, we're all in a lot of trouble.
So I think we got to say this, otherwise we'll get into a little bit of trouble. But anti-Semitism is real in Australia, and it absolutely exists in Australia, just like any other form of racism and discrimination against any other community. And just like any other community, the Jewish community should have the same levels of safety and protection that every other community in Australia should have. And I think that's the big point about all of this, the same level of protection that everybody else has and should have. And there also, ultimately, I think there just has to be a clear distinction between anti-Semitism and criticism of Israel or Zionism. Yet, to me, it just seems like every time there's a crisis like October 7, 2023, or the Bondi attacks, or going back to all these other massacres and attacks that have been happening on Palestinian people, whenever there's a crisis in Israel, West Bank, Gaza, wherever, there's always this new push to criminalise the criticism of Israel and Zionism, as if doing all of these clampdowns is going to stop anti-Semitism or any attacks in the future. That's not going to happen. I'd argue it would actually make things a lot worse. And healthy democracies, well, they're meant to have this balance of protecting minorities equally while also protecting the political dissent or political debate of the stuff that we don't necessarily agree with. And we had all of those cookies in Melbourne in Bourke Street for 2 years, I think it was, protesting about COVID lockdowns and vaccines and all that sort of stuff. I didn't agree with them. I actually hated that. That was a total nuisance. But the thing is that that's what being part of a democracy is all about, that we have to listen to the stuff that we do not agree with, because that's the democratic process. And also, if you're getting governments to decide what is acceptable political criticism and what isn't, and it's on behalf of one group and not the other, I think that's when you start getting all of these problems that are very difficult to undo.
I'm thinking of several political names who tried to frame the protest debate. They're not the great figures of history, shall we say. Pinochet in Chile, Perón in Argentina, Mao Zedong in China, Joseph Stalin in Russia. There was a German guy who was born in Austria. We all know who I'm talking about. Ceausescu in Romania. On it goes. It never ends well. A healthy populace needs dissent, even if the dissent is immature, childish, and based on what I reckon rather than what is. And that goes down to disagreeing with the referee's calls in football or the umpire's calls in cricket. It might get annoying if you're sitting in the sand next to a rabid fan who can't believe that their team is losing so badly, but that's okay. As long as you don't hurt anyone, you're allowed to protest. And it gets to the more, I'll be careful saying important because I know that there's a lot of our listeners who are sport fans out there, but the more obviously impactful to outsiders, things like cuts to welfare, cuts to health, cuts to education, increases to defence, increases to AUKUS, increases to law and order. We need to discuss these things. We need to debate these things. Having a large, noisy, messy protest, not a violent one, is perfectly okay. Yes, it's inconvenient, but they're meant to be inconvenient. We shouldn't have you people protest here because it's out of the way of the dignitaries. You protest where you can get to, and you stay safe, and you don't break any laws, and you don't get violent, and all of that. But loud, messy, rude, obnoxious, all that's fine. And to get back to the Royal Commission, to try and define things so politically, and let's be fair, we don't know the outcome of the Royal Commission yet. We're just hearing evidence. And this may go to the High Court, and the High Court may find something else. So the Royal Commissions tend to have an end, and then it's up to the government to decide what recommendations they take. Some Royal Commissions, they take everything. This could be an excuse for the Labor government to bring in Gillian Segal's ridiculous and, quite frankly, idiotic plans. Or it could be that the government will do what it did with the first draft of Gillian Segal's report and put it in the bottom drawer and say, we'll look at that later. Then circumstances suggested that they needed to bring it out again.
Oh, sure. But the New South Wales Supreme, or the Federal Court, I think it was, they've already rejected that IHRA definition of anti-Semitism. They ruled it out in the Court of Law last year. Yeah.
The Royal Commission has to be careful. Royal Commissions need credibility. And being an avid watcher of Yes Prime Minister and Yes Minister, I do know that you never hold an inquiry till you know what the results are before it runs. But they've got to be careful, because any of this stuff could well be thrown over by the High Court or by any of the state Supreme Courts, which will make them look foolish and not help the cause at all. I believe the cause is to stop people being anti-Semitic, anti-Islamophobic, anti-racism, anti-homophobic, anti-sexist, misogynist, the whole thing. I won't list all of them because it's all horrible and we want it gone. And if the Royal Commission can pivot to that, we might have something useful. Won't get rid of it all at once, of course, but it could be a major step.
That's it for this episode of New Politics. Thanks for listening in. And if you value independent journalism without the influence of corporate backing, join New Politics at newpolitics.com.au and support us directly. It's just $5 per month, and we always try to keep it very simple. If you like what we do, please send some support our way. It keeps our commitment to independent journalism ticking along. I'm Eddie Djokovic. Thanks for listening in, and it's goodbye to our listeners.
I'm David Lewis. We'll see you next time.